Hello, RotoBallers. For many, it's a win and you're in when it comes to fantasy championships. So let's go get it this week. Here's my must-start running backs and tight ends for week number 16. And let's kick them off with the running back position, starting with Breece Hall versus the Washington Commanders. Miami held Hall to 12 yards on just 6 carries, which probably cost a lot of people a chance at these fantasy semifinals. But that was last week, and the Commanders are certainly not the Miami Dolphins when it comes to fantasy defenses. In fact, Washington is allowing the second most fantasy points to opposing backs over the last 4 weeks, allowing more than 32 fantasy points per game, and just surrendered 150 plus yards and a touchdown on the ground last week to Kyren Williams. Over the last 4 weeks, the Commanders have allowed 17 receptions for 77 yards, and that bodes well for Breece Hall, not to mention the 385 yards and 6 total touchdowns over that period. Now, of note, Zach Wilson ignored his concussion symptoms there to try and stay in the game last week, but he finally had to give way to Trevor Siemian, so I'd expect Siemian to be under center again for this one. Now, my second running back this week is Bijan Robinson versus the Indianapolis Colts. Christmas is a season of forgiveness, and remember, forgiveness isn't just for those who did you wrong, it's for you as well. It's part of the healing process, and we all need a little bit of healing during the fantasy football playoffs. Robinson, like Hall, he did you wrong last week, I get it, and despite the Colts holding Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren in check last week, they are still allowing more than 25 fantasy points per game to the position this season, and 26 plus fantasy points over the last 4 weeks, which happens to be the third most. Indianapolis, over those last 4 weeks, they have yielded 659 total yards there and 4 touchdowns to backs. And you have to feel that Arthur Smith is going to be giving fantasy managers what they want for Christmas. This is his chance to be Arthur Christmas, right? Now, the third running back that I feel this week is Aaron Jones versus the Carolina Panthers. It looks like A.J. Dillon could be trending toward missing another contest. That means, once again, Aaron Jones should shoulder a majority of the load for the Packers out of the backfield this week. Now, last week, it was great to see Jones get through the game and not end up back on the injury report. In PPR, his return netted you 11 fantasy points. In 5 of the Panthers' last 6 contests, they are allowing at least 80 yards and a touchdown to backs. And over the course of the season, they are allowing more than 25.5 fantasy points per game, thanks to a league-high 17 rushing touchdowns against. Jones hit 8 carries on that first drive before the Packers kind of pulled him back on those touches, but expect those touches to significantly increase this week and moving forward. As for those running backs you're sitting, it starts with Tony Pollard versus the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins have been the 14th stingiest unit over the last 4 weeks and the 9th toughest defense in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position this season. Pollard, he was held to 57 yards against the Bills last week, and you have to feel that this game, there could be a little bit of an airing and out type process as 2 of the most prolific passing teams go head to head. Now, I've been watching some film lately, and Rico Dowdle has been earning more work on passing downs, as it seems that Prescott has put more faith in his pass protection than he does with Pollard's, and that's maybe a bigger deal than I'm making it out to be. Maybe it's something, maybe it's not, but this could mean more Dowdle down the stretch. As for the second running back you're fading, it's Tai Chandler versus the Detroit Lions. It was a great matchup last week, and Tai Chandler balled out and produced for fantasy managers. This week, the matchup is much tougher, facing a Lions team that is allowing just 17.5 fantasy points over the last 4 weeks and have given up just 245 yards on the ground. Alexander Madison, he's trending towards returning to action this week, which will cut into Chandler's touches. So factoring less of a load there with a tougher matchup, you have to protect yourself from chasing those points last week when it comes to this Vikings back. And the third running back you're fading is Gus Edwards versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now's not the time to get cute. I know Edwards steps in here as a RB1 with the Keaton Mitchell injury, but this 49ers defense has been doing one thing and doing one thing really well as of late, and that is phasing out opposing running backs. It's that simple. Gus Edwards may be obsolete by the end of the first quarter with how good this 49ers defense has been playing. Now for those tight ends, the first tight end you are starting, we are going to follow the points in this situation here, and that is Hunter Henry versus the Denver Broncos. Sometimes things just make too much sense here when it comes to fantasy. Denver, they are allowing the third most fantasy points to tight ends over the last 4 weeks there. And on the season, no team has allowed more fantasy production to the position than the Broncos have. As for Henry, only David Njoku and Evan Ingram have more fantasy points over the last 2 weeks there than Henry's 38.6. Henry is averaging 5 receptions along with a 20.3% target share over the last 2 contests while scoring 3 touchdowns. Now, I'm not good at math, but but I know a thing or two about fantasy, and that adds up to a must-start this week. As for another must-start tight end, it is Trey McBride versus Chicago. Speaking of tight ends who are producing this season versus defenses that are allowing production to the tight end position, let me introduce you to Trey McBride. Since week number 7, McBride is averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game, while the Bears are allowing 17 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. On the season, the Bears have allowed 714 receiving yards and 7 touchdown grabs to the tight end position. Again, the math seems pretty simple. Don't overthink it. And the third tight end you're starting this week is Evan Ingram versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Ingram is a tight end 5 this season, and before last week, he had 23 or more fantasy points in back-to-back contests. Upside, people, upside! Tampa Bay has been better in recent weeks, allowing just 12.5 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But on the season, they're allowing over 13.6 per game, which happens to be the 5th most. As for those tight ends you're sitting, you are sitting Dallas Goedert versus the New York Football Giants. They are one of the best teams when it comes to defending the tight end position, believe it or not. Over the last 4 weeks, they are allowing just 12.3 fantasy points per game to the position, and throughout the season, they've been giving up less than 10 fantasy points per game thanks to 609 yards on 55 receptions. Meanwhile, they are allowing 38.4 fantasy points to wide receivers, which happens to be the 5th most. So I'm expecting this to be more of a Devontae Smith type game than it is a Dallas Goedert game. The second tight end that I'm sitting this week is Isaiah Likely versus the San Francisco 49ers. Here we are in week number 16, and the 49ers have only allowed a tight end into the end zone on 2 occasions. They've allowed just 586 yards and less than 10 fantasy points per game. I don't like this matchup for the Ravens or Likely this week. And Fred Warner and Drew Greenlaw are 2 of the best in the middle of that San Francisco 49ers defense. So Likely, he has been seeing targets, but those windows this week are going to be much, much smaller. The third tight end that I'm seeing this week is Darren Waller versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I can't trust Waller, the not-so-good baller. If you have a girl, you should get on the phone and call her and say, do not start the Giants tight end. Sure, Waller's seen 6 targets last week, but this Eagles team, they are reeling right now, and this is a get-right type game for their defense. Over the last 3 weeks, they have held opposing tight ends to under 8 fantasy points in non-PPR formats while allowing just 209 yards. Heck, in fantasy, you need your tight end to score touchdowns, which is something that the Eagles have not let happen over that 4-week period. You've made it this far without Waller. Just keep doing what you're doing. Avoid Waller altogether. That brings us up to letting you know that this video is being recorded on Monday, so plenty can still happen between now and Sunday's kickoffs. So check out RotoBaller.com and the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe to the RotoBaller YouTube channel for plenty more great fantasy football analysis.